Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our July 14th Economic Development Commission meeting. Thanks for joining at another off-cycle Friday morning here. Today's meeting, we're primarily going to be focusing on follow-up from last month's conversation on outdoor dining. But before we get into that, let's take a look at the minutes from our most recent meeting on June 30th, where we talked about the recommended changes to the ordinance. So everyone's had a chance to review the minutes.
I move we approve them.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Any opposed? Okay, thanks, everybody. So next we'll run through our standing items for updates. First on here is the EDC ordinance that we did talk about and make some further edits to at our last meeting, which, Vince, do you want to walk us through next steps and updates on?
Yeah, well, the changes the only changes that were really made beyond what came back to us was the timing of new or reappointments or new appointments. And so that went through, and just that minimal 5-word change, I think, that Tom put in, went through legal, and they looked at it, and it's going to governance on Monday. I think it's Monday.
It is Monday.
So we can get it onto the council at the next meeting.
Perfect. Okay, thanks for that. And then, do either of our land use liaisons have an update for the group?
Joanna, did you go to the meeting last month? Because I didn't.
I apologize. I did not. But yeah, I did not. So I can give a better update for next month. A big part of what we're going over, which also plays to the council update, is that some of the zoning ordinances went to the planning board for review. Were sent back to city council. There were some changes recommended by the planning board that were considered heavy enough to require an additional second reading. So we've added a city council meeting on the 24th, and we will be going over that again.
And I did speak to Beth about the meeting, and a couple of things she mentioned were just they reviewed the ADU ordinance again, and just for some minor details, and to go over it with Howard, who's the housing navigator, and we're looking at maybe expanding the Gateway District a bit, and maybe going from one lot back to two. So, and then really looking deeper into the city in terms of where there might be opportunities for housing. So that's kind of where we're at.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bob. And then, Sean, anything from your office?
Phil, just one quick update in deference to our outdoor dining conversation. Separate topic, the employer toolkit that I've been talking about for a few months, that is, it's out. It launched a couple of days ago. It's going to be a series of videos. It's going to be accessible really for the next few months for employers in terms of how to attract, retain, and develop employees. And that's what we've heard regionally, and that's what we worked on. A reminder that was $20,000 that we received from Business and Economic Affairs from the state to pay for that. And it was produced by a local Portsmouth marketing company. So pretty exciting. I'll be sending those out. We'll be pushing those out on our website and on our social media channels to make sure that all employers have access to it. And that's what I have for today. Thanks.
Great. And we have the city council update next, but I'm talking with Councilor Lombardi. He's okay if we move our outdoor dining update and commentary ahead of that, and then save that for the close of the meeting. So with that, do we have the PowerPoint that we can pull up? So to kind of level set for both for the commission and for those who have joined us again from the public. So we thank you guys for coming. Circling back to the request that was referred to us by the council, we were asked to look at outdoor dining and consider what had been in place from the original cafe policy and review the COVID policy as well as updates that have been made annually since, and really review that in an effort to make recommendations back to the council in order for them to take this up and consider any adoption of an ordinance. So what we're doing is essentially reviewing what's in place, considering what, as we talked about last month, trying to review equitability policies, some design best practices that we aim to include, that we're then going to present back to the council, which will then reopen up for further public comment. So what we're doing is not setting the ordinance. We're not drafting an ordinance. We are coming up with a set of recommendations that we would present to the council that we believe set the stage for outdoor dining to remain in any future form as in an effort to get the best product possible and get some consistency. And just following up, I want to thank everyone that came last week, I think, not last week, last month, and for providing your feedback and commentary. The four-person working group did have a chance to meet since and did discuss some further changes. Hopefully you'll see those reflected in today's presentation, and we'll bring those back for further comment from the full Economic Development Commission, but we also want to hear from everyone who came to speak, and just also want to reiterate we did receive some communications overnight with some feedback on this presentation, which we'll certainly take into consideration before we make any further recommendations back to the council. So appreciate everyone's time, and with that, let's jump to what we have and kind of walk through updates.
Okay.
Go to the first slide.
Mr. Chair, can I ask if Ann can walk us through again, and then I'll add the staff comments, because we did meet with staff earlier this week.
Fine, or we were sort of
Yeah,
going
Ann
to
and I
tag
can talk.
team.
Oh, okay, you guys-
I think
Yeah.
I'll kind of provide.
I don't know if you're waiting for me.
When you're over there, Phil, you'll need the mic.
Thank you.
Thanks.
How's that? So I'll kind of walk us through some of the additional conversation that the working group had, and I think Ann can provide any input, and Sean, you can certainly provide city staff
Please.
feedback, because this was circulated to staff, and they provided some additional edits and commentary. But we certainly recognize that one of the concerns is the usage of on-street parking spaces, and feedback that we heard from retailers about those coming offline. So one thing that we had talked about as the working group is whether we would want to provide an opportunity for retailers to also apply for a permit for usage under this program in an effort to try to bring more fairness. That was sent back, and the staff, certainly, Sean, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'll just speak to that. I think in walking through this, we really met with the staff who was responsible for receiving applications and basically approving them and working with applicants. And so there was concern about how a space would be used if it wasn't for outdoor dining. So that was really, that's where their comments came from. There's different safety concerns. When you're in outdoor dining, you're seated, the space is laid out in a certain way. It's more or less, I'll say, permanent, even though sometimes chairs and things are stacked. So in the spirit of the request from City Council, the thought was staff was asking the EDC to focus on outdoor dining, and if there's a different issue regarding other use of public space, that could be a separate issue that if the council would like EDC to take it up, or if EDC would like to proactively suggest that to City Council, it should be separate, because it was not part of this request, and it is a different, it does have different parameters. So that was the staff feedback.
If anyone has any
Any questions on
thoughts
that?
or comments.
Yeah, I do. Just one quick comment on that topic. I think it's important to note that in the course of this process, even if we're going to separate this out as a separate issue, we have to make sure that we look at this in context. We've discovered that in the course of our research. We've discovered that in the course of public comment. I think it's common sense in walking down the streets that the dining doesn't exist as a separate entity within the economy. So it certainly, as we put our recommendation back to the city council, I think it's important to make sure that that context remains so that we do take it into account. The city takes it into account as we move forward.
Great.
I would just add to that, I think it was in part of the intent of the council, it was my understanding, I might be wrong, but that the consideration of how we deal with an equitable treatment to businesses other than restaurants as well. So although that wasn't stated, it was an outdoor dining thing, I think that was a concern that has been expressed by the council
Right.
as well. So I agree with Alan that I think it needs to have that context.
Okay. So I think that was the only change on this slide.
Roll on.
And so traffic, circling back to this, certainly Sean can provide comment, and I know we've had feedback from the public about what staff recommendations were and what this year's adoption was in the travel lanes.
Yeah. Phil, I'm sorry, Phil.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And it was just it was, I won't say a clever, but when it was a language issue of maintain current limitations of traffic flow as per city staff recommendations. And that I guess, they're maintained as of last year, but that was, city staff actually objected to outdoor dining in travel lanes. So just to clarify the comment there, to make it as accurate as we possibly can.
If I can add to that, I believe that in 2022, we talked about the safety and dining and travel lanes, but we made it clear that our recommendation would be 22 was a year to transition out of the COVID era, and that as a matter of right and safety, to recognize streets are for viatic uses and to not have travel lanes. So we thought we gave a sort of a heads-up warning. 22 would be the last time to dine in travel lanes, and it remains there.
So I think that's probably one of the larger topics for discussion today based on feedback we had last month, and also some recommendations we've made as the working group, but we'll have further discussion on that. And just a clarifying change with whether it's to remain open on the one-way streets. I think we can jump to the next slide. And so this is clarification. We had some dialogue last month in terms of the application deadline, and I know this past year, I think the deadline was April 1st for installation of barriers by May 1st, when
We
the
didn't
season
have
began.
a deadline, right?
I think there was one, but it was pretty porous.
Right,
Like a rolling deadline almost.
correct.
Yeah. So,
And that was tough to work with, to be honest. And by the way, the thing that's blocked out says length of season. Sorry, I don't want to move that bar.
yeah, so not recommending any change to the length of the season, but I think in conversation at the working group, we were in agreement that there should be a initial deadline and a time frame for delivery of barriers to allow staff time to actually bring them on site if they were required in the usage.
Right. So Phil, that last bullet in green from staff is talking about, what's a reasonable date for them to be able to plan to get barriers out and to prepare for outdoor dining. And April 10th is where that group landed and wanted to suggest that, and also took into account if you open up after April 10th and outdoor dining is part of your plan, we want to be somewhat flexible if you've opened after that. Opening as a new business, new business.
Okay. Tom?
Are we going to cover the changes between the last draft and this draft separate from the staff comments as well as we go along, or do you want us to hold those until later?
I think we can do them as we go.
Okay.
My suggestion.
Well, just, I had a question. Again, first of all, I apologize to everybody if this is a little redundant, because I was not at the last meeting in June because I was traveling. But I did watch the YouTube tape of the meeting, and I noticed this time we've changed the abutter notice requirement to just ground floor.
floor.
And I guess I had questions why that was the case. The initial recommendation was that it would be ground floor plus second floor offices or what have you. And I as I read through this material, a question that came to my mind is, are we limiting that approval, whatever floor, to the occupants, or are we going to request that of the owners of the buildings as well? Now, part of the reason I say that is because if you have a multi-story mixed-use building, the owner, or the landlord, probably has some interest in whether there's activity down in front as it may impact the upper floors. So, for instance, if it's residential, the owner may care about not causing additional noise to his upper floor tenants. And so I guess I'm interested in knowing the reasoning behind that change, because in my mind, I think there are additional considerations.
Yeah, and I think that's open for discussion. I think the intent was the businesses affected on that ground floor, but certainly throughout the city, there's different numbers of stories above grade, and oftentimes some of the buildings that might be owned by somebody may have a tenant in there. Bob?
Is it who do we need approval from, the abutting business or landlord?
Good question.
That's what Tom's asking.
Yeah, that's, I think, Tom's question.
Currently, is it the abutting operating business?
Currently, it's the first floor tenant.
Yeah.
Tenant, yeah.
Because it could be a landlord that owns the whole building.
Sure, that's I think
Or
Tom's point.
up, right?
Is there precedent for a butter approval for other permits, and might we be able to use that language for other purposes, for other city processes?
Not that I'm aware of, but we can look into that.
I can.
Finding in a butter and a butter approval seems to me like something we would want beyond just the scope of this.
Let me try to find out.
So it's certainly up for comment. I mean, the working group recommendations are not final, and that's why we're here to talk about it. So I think there's a strong feeling that it needs to be full real estate occupants within a property. I think that's up for discussion.
And again, part of my, I guess I have an inquiry before a comment, because this is a change from the first draft, and when I listened to the program, I didn't see that there was a consensus to change it to ground floor only. And so I'm interested in the reasoning as much as anything else at this point.
Sure. I think operationally was my, there was not a lot of robust dialogue around that. So I think it was a distinction in terms of obligation on city staff and for permitting, but.
Yeah, I don't remember the conversation about, okay, we absolutely have to change this, so I'm not, and I didn't know that we actually, well, so today, you have in place what was in place in 22 and rolled over to 23, right, which is just the abutter first floor. So that's I guess a current state. And to your point, Tom, if the EDC wants to suggest something different, then that's an option.
I know we did add in annually as well. Ann?
Yeah, I feel like we just hadn't defined a butter last month, and that's when the discussion came up of what do we mean by a butter? Is it just ground floor? Is it, so it's not really that we changed it, we just never defined it.
My question, really, I looked at the first draft, and it simply said it just a butter approval.
Mm-hmm.
And so the subcommittee decided to define it. I didn't hear any discussion about it at the last meeting. So I'm trying to figure out what's the subcommittee's rationale for limiting it to ground floor.
Jacob?
I have another kind of comment on it. For those second floor businesses, it's kind of tough to determine like the boundary of where their business technically goes. Like a ground floor, you can very clearly see like that picture, very clear here it is. But a second floor office could span, a residential could span. So at what point do we need approval if we go second floor? And as a second floor resident in downtown, I would say that having like those ground floor parking spaces, like, yeah, I have some skin in the game of that, right? But like at what point do you just say that the whole building has to agree on it? So I think we need to set like a specific limit of where we're actually going to need approval from. But as a second floor resident, I do feel that I agree with Tom here. It's an interesting kind of, it's an interesting note that we switched it.
Yeah, I think the challenge is it becomes all occupants in the building, but I think that's a fair point. Any more questions or comments on that? I think we can go next to our fee consideration. So just reiterating what we discussed last month in terms of what should be considered by the fee committee in the scope of this, in enabling that fee committee comprised of the council members to make that determination. One thing we have not included here was a minimum threshold. I think our intent is to get more fully reimbursed for the economic loss that's considered for those parking spaces coming offline. There is incoming permit fee to the tune of $80,000 this year to offset that, and we haven't mapped out full economics, but the intent would be that the fee committee would have the ability to do so each year because those costs are going to be changing. So open that up for further comment, or if we wanted to set potentially a floor in our recommendations to them so that it's at a minimum increase from where they are and to a level we think reasonable, or if it's important to give them the ability to determine that. Go ahead, Everett.
Excuse me, Phil. I think missing here might have been the administrative cost too. I think it's inferred, but I think the intent, if I'm correct, was we didn't feel it was the city's obligation to subsidize the cost of the program for the restaurants.
Well, I
and
think
that the fully
that's the third bullet, isn't
yeah, but it
it?
doesn't say administrative cost. So when you take the application and someone reviews it and
Yeah, but
people
we did
opine
discuss
on
it.
it.
I
So,
agree.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, that was absolutely part of our.
Right. And again, just the intent being the fully burdened cost of the program should be passed on to the restaurant. The loss of parking revenue, the cost to install the barriers and remove them, if that includes paint annually or whatever, and then the administrative costs. So the fully burdened cost of the
Okay. I've made a note of that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Tom?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this particular issue. I think there is a big equity argument that runs through this, and I'm not sure we're fully stating it here. I would advocate for a recommendation that suggests that any consideration of the use of public property has to take into consideration not only the fairness to the restaurant owner, but also the fairness to other businesses in the area, and the fairness to the taxpayer. And I don't think the taxpayer has been considered in the fee structure we're proposing. I also have concern about the second bullet point that says that there ought to be a uniform pricing per square foot of usable space, because I think there are different spaces that justify different cost. And so as I've approached this, I think that there ought to be a base fee for this that takes into consideration all those things. And then there ought to be, and so I think the traditional restaurant use of a sidewalk under the 2012 ordinance, where there's no Jersey barriers, there's no, concern about the streetscape and that type of thing. Whether it's $10 a square foot or another number, there ought to be a base fee, and that ought to apply across the board to wherever it's located. And then I think as you get into other locations, such as the travelway or parking spaces, then we ought to say that fee should be different, because it should also include the lost revenue to the city in terms of parking, in terms of that, the cost to the city as well. And then finally, I think that what's not discussed here, and hasn't been at all, is that we ought to take into consideration the value of this space to the restaurants. I've listened to some of the city council meetings in the past in which there's been concern about burdening the restaurants, but the reality is that restaurants generate the most gross revenue per square foot of any of the downtown businesses, and where this is a significant benefit to them. I tried to do some quick research yesterday to see if I could come up with statistics, and of course my research skills were inadequate to do it, but I found one note that the Toast, that software program that is used for point of service charging in various restaurants, they did a study among their customers and said that a typical restaurant that's less than 12 months old generates about $111,000 per month in revenue. And restaurants that are older than that are significantly more. I also noted that part of the problem is we have no data on which we're being asked to make these decisions. But I noticed that one restaurant owner in the paper was complaining that if he was not allowed to have his outdoor dining on a city street, he would lose about $300,000 in revenue for that 6-month period of time. So to me, there's a real value, and I think this is somewhat unique to restaurants because I don't think most retail stores generate the same level of revenue as restaurants. And so I don't think it would be fair to taxpayers and to other retail, not just retailers, but other commercial activity in the downtown area or on public streets in general, to essentially give this away. So I would advocate for having a base fee and then adjusting it based upon what the costs are and the lost revenue is at locations off the sidewalk, so to speak.
Great comments. Any response, thoughts on that?
So were you saying that the restaurants should be charged as almost like the opportunity cost of having that spot? Are you saying the restaurants are charged that, or you're looking at the cost of the retail spaces and the taxpayer would also go into the restaurant's fee? And then what are you calculating like the taxpayer burden on this, I guess, just so I understand a little more?
Well, so the taxpayer burden is that we have, this is public property, and we're turning that property over for exclusive use by a for-profit company.
For a fee. Right.
That's right. I'm simply advocating that the fee factor in not just the cost and the lost revenue, but the value added to the business. I mean, before my retirement, I negotiated leases that, including those with restaurants, in which this was a factor in the negotiation, and ultimately was a factor in what the landlord was able to charge.
Would that require us taking a look at like the restaurant's books and figuring out how much they're actually making?
No, I don't think we have. I don't think it should be done on a case-by-case basis. I still think you want to have. You don't want to create an administrative, morass. But I think you can recognize that this is a value that which you can impact what the charge is going to be. I don't think it should. We don't want to get into asking restaurants or anybody else to open up their books and then determine what their profit's going to be and then do a profit sharing. That's not what I have in mind.
I think it's fair to ask the fee committee to consider all of the factors that you've identified in addition to just the cost of the city maintaining that. I think that's all you're asking for,
That's
correct?
exactly. My recommendation is that a big picture be. And so I'm just suggesting when we make this recommendation, we include all those factors as part of it.
I do like the idea of a baseline because, someone like Popovers, for instance, or Elephantine, they don't affect parking. And so I think it's a different situation than someone like the Goat, which takes up a road. So, I think there is a difference there.
One question regarding fees related to travel lanes. I think from the previous slide, the recommendation from city staff is not to have outdoor dining in travel lanes. So are we sort of all in agreement there, and that wouldn't be part of the fee considerations because it would no longer be a permitted use?
I think that's up for discussion today.
Okay.
We had made a change from our last meeting that doesn't quite fully exclude travel lanes, but I think that warrants a full discussion, and if we land there, then I agree, then it should come out. It wouldn't be a factor because it would not be an option.
Maybe travel lane wasn't the right.
Well, it's a fair point. A travel lane is different than a parking space.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, a parking space is different than just a sidewalk.
Yeah. So I think the intent of the working group initially was to try to streamline and make it equitable, but I recognize that they have different impact. So the change in red was really to capture what was missing from last month's conversation about the annual application and review and compliance by city staff. And again, the design standards would not be part of the ordinance. It would be an exhibit reference within the ordinance, so that if there's changes that the city would need to be able to make, that it would be a more easily adaptable living document outside of the rigidity of the ordinance itself.
My question here is who is responsible for creating the design standards?
So we've made recommendations as the working group based on some very common standard industry practices, safety, and certainly as part of all of this, we're deferring to city staff for safety factors. We may make great design recommendations, but it has to satisfy the city's staff and engineers, and I think that's a key piece. I think you can't look at them in isolation, but I don't think that we're qualified to make any recommendations for safety or, travel lane or parking.
I guess the question is whether the easy to modify document becomes policy that is established from staff or something that the council or some other work, referral from the council would create and maintain. I think given the scope of where design standards could have impact, I think it's important to either ask the city council to name an entity to be responsible for crafting and modifying it, or to suggest one. It's not clear to me who would be responsible for this.
That's a fair point.
To make it clear.
And administratively, can I just ask the city manager and Sean, so if these design standards exist, I'm assuming they would be inspected, reviewed the same way that an application would be currently, and their certificate of occupancy would be issued upon compliance.
Right, if you get into, as you go down the line here, I'll hit on that, but the second bullet, the group asked us to add the word vehicular traffic, right? Just to remind us that it's pedestrian and vehicular traffic that we're trying to protect and have the flow. But when you come down to the fifth bullet, this really talks about, getting, I guess, requiring applicants to provide more information. And as we're looking at these specifically platforms, and you see some of the things that are being built to varying degrees, city staff would like to be able to issue permits and to be able to confirm that safety requirements are being met. That happens today. That's part of that administrative cost that we talked about, going out and doing walkthroughs. And to the city manager's point earlier, we're into this new mode of where it's not about helping people survive and doing whatever we have to do. This is now really pushing hard on safety and design, and having a process and giving the city staff the ability to make things equitable in terms of access, in terms of safety, in terms of design, whatever point we get to with that. There was even a comment made about power source. People are just businesses are just putting things out there to do their thing. And heretofore, the city has allowed that to varying degrees. And I think everyone's at this point where we want to make it permanent, we want to make it safe, we want to make it equitable, and we have a lot of work being done behind the scenes. And I think our recommendation ought to be to let the experts do what they do well based on an ordinance that comes out of City Council.
And one clarification, go ahead, Andy.
Just to piggyback a bit on that, I was just wondering if the committee had heard or consulted with the HDC on this piece, the design standards. Most of these applicants that when I've looked at the list, fall within the historic district. And in my experience with working with the HDC project, they have an incredible passion for design standards in the historic district to the point where long conversations come out on this. I was just wondering if that conversation has been had. These recommendations are all starting to feel like they're advocating for a level of permanence. Personally, I wish we could design our way out of it with curb alignments and, the redesign of Market Square and stuff. And I know that's 10, 20 years out, but I was just wondering if the HDC is involved.
They haven't been yet. I think that could be part of our recommendations back to the council, that they confirm that with the HDC and have, really aesthetic review. The clarification I was going to make was that I think as we're envisioning it, it would only apply to the usage of public spaces. So those who already have private spaces, outdoor dining, umbrellas that might not fit this criteria, that would be outside of the scope of this. This is for anyone seeking an annual permit for outdoor dining. So if we need to clarify that better, we certainly can. But Andy, I think your point is a very fair one, and I think we've tried to address that with a lot of the design standards, but we're not design professionals, despite all of our opinions or some of our background. So I think that's a good takeaway. Bob?
Yeah, you mentioned permanence, and when I think of permanence, I don't think of permanent use of Jersey barriers downtown taking away parking spaces. I think of permanence as a redesigned downtown. So I think we need to keep that in mind. And I guess I'd like to hear from city staff about that. And there was a comment before that said, over the objections of city staff. So I'm not sure, at least I haven't heard what city staff recommended with regard to outdoor dining. If city staff said we don't want any, other than sidewalk dining, or not.
Let me take a stab, and Sean, fill in
Sure.
if I may, Mr. Chair. I think there's a recognition that what we're talking about today gets us to and through a Market Square revisioning that reimagines what ought to be more permanent to the word of use of the word permanent, because we're just I'll say limping along, but we are trying to accommodate a variety of uses where they weren't considered when the rights of way were established for certain purposes. So I would say it's fair to think about these as transitional policies until such time as we have a more permanent and redesigned Market Square and downtown area, and then if there's a desire to have dining where either roads or parking spots are right now, we need to think about that.
Right.
So
Okay.
I feel like this is an interim step, if you will.
Sure, yeah, and I wasn't in the conversation about redesigning Market Square, but I plan to be in the future. I mean, it's, I've heard things about wider sidewalks and things of that nature that may accommodate different uses, but that's to be determined. I hope it's not 10 or 20 years away. I hope it's less. But having said that, I'll just speak to your question, Bob, about the staff objection. Specifically, in that bullet point, it was referring to staff, and this came out, and it's out there on our website. It's in the planning department, that basically they do not recommend outdoor dining in travel lanes at all. That's a significant objection.
How about parking spaces?
They're okay with that.
They're okay with that. Okay.
That's my recollection. Yeah, but it's documented, it's on the website.
Okay.
Yeah, we haven't wavered from that. I think the treatment of parking spaces depends on the area in which you're trying to dine in a space and what it's protecting against, if it's a leading edge or a faster moving street.
Thank you for clarifying that.
We good? Did you talk about the last bullet, Sean?
We'll just add it again to try to allow staff to make good decisions and treat people equitably. A little more detail in the application is what they're asking for.
Okay.
Makes sense.
And so the only change and clarification from last month's presentation on this is the change made by staff. So,
Yeah, along those same lines of getting the information ahead of time versus showing up and not knowing what to expect in terms of furniture. They would like a plan ahead of time.
Really to be baked into the application
Right.
request.
Right.
Okay. No changes.
changes on this slide. Go to the next. So this is reflective of what we heard from folks that came and spoke last month about the, primarily about the intersection at Congress and how dangerous that was with visibility. And so we consulted the city's traffic engineer.
Yep.
Yeah. Who provided some recommendations in terms of sight lines and maximum height. We in the response, it was commented that if dining were to remain, certain heights should be in place. We kind of took that a step further and said should not be allowed within 30 feet of the back of the crosswalk, which I think is more an industry standard for visibility, and parking is not allowed any closer than that currently, so that seemed appropriate. But at least in the instance of the Congress Street, that would still allow for some outdoor dining to remain in that travel lane, but I think that's up for discussion and conversation today, so.
I'll just mention on that third bullet that the staff would want to strike that 20 feet from a stop sign and just make it consistent, 30 feet from a traffic light or a stop sign.
You know, Phil, as we met as a subcommittee and talked about dining in the travel lane, as I sit with that further, I guess we were very much focused on the 30 feet back, and at least I wasn't thinking about, well, what that excludes, for example, in the case we were talking about, this would exclude the Jumpin' Jays dining, but would allow, again, the goat to exist. And I don't know if that solves the problem. We still have vehicular traffic trying to negotiate around that. I think I would feel more consistent with what the city staff has recommended, that there should be no dining in travel lanes. I just think it's a real safety concern.
Point of order. So, Chair, point of order. Tom, can I jump in 1 second? Just point of order. The group that meets, that's smaller than this group, is a working group or a work group. It is not a subcommittee. I just want to clarify that because I've learned a lot about what that means.
Okay.
And I want to make sure that we are being consistent because that's the process.
Okay.
It's a work group. Thank you, Everett.
Tom?
I had a question on this barrier design height. So the previous slide addressed barriers on sidewalks, and I didn't really see a limit on the height, but when you get to the barriers on parking spaces in the travel lane, you have a 6-foot height. I think as a matter of good streetscape design that there should not be barriers that are 6 feet or high on a sidewalk. Whether they're clear through or they're solid so you can't see through them. The whole concept of sharing the sidewalk with a restaurant is that it adds to the streetscape, and I think when you create barriers that are 6 feet high, it's almost like another wall. So I would I think we'd want to have like a 3-foot or 3.5 foot limit on the dividers between the restaurant space and the public walkway on sidewalks. I think the 6 feet is fine in the street because you're dealing with automobile fumes, that type of stuff. Although I do get concerned that as you drive by some of them, it creates a tunnel effect. And, the combination of having, concrete Jersey barriers and then something above it, you get these narrow tunnels that you're driving down, quote, for safety purposes. But again, you lose the whole impact of having a blend of the public and private use of the public space.
I had Jacob next, but
I didn't know if there's any discussion around the exemptions of travel lanes, because Congress Street with Jumpin' Jays and the Goat is very much different than a travel lane that Dwyer's is using. And so I didn't know if that 1,000 car thing that currently is going on now is going to be considered for the travel lane for these recommendations, because Jumpin' Jays and the Goat, that seems to be the topic of discussion, but there are other restaurants using travel lanes that that might still work. So I didn't know if there's any discussion around the amount of usage of a travel lane or the situation that it's in. I didn't know if there was any discussion as part of that group.
at the city. You mean
At the working group or wherever, the city staff, anything like that.
Yeah, so the working group, I would say, in the initial response was okay with travel lanes, provided there was a minimum amount of accessibility, 2 lanes if it were a 2-lane road, if one were to remain open, if it were one-way. I think today's discussion is different than that, and I think it's up for topic, but I think if the working group and the commission were to adopt the city's recommendations in terms of travel lanes, to me, that's travel lanes. But that's, I think if there's a distinction, we would want to make that distinction. If there's minimum impact and
I sat in on the conversation staff had, and I don't think we talked about the different types of, Dwyer's versus Goat, but we want to achieve uniform standards. That's what we talked about. So we would treat,
Yeah, we
we would have the same standard.
I am recalling a comment about safety, about access to get through that space that Dwyer's takes now, because there are residents back there and there's parking, and fire things would have to be moved, I think, in a worst case scenario. So from a consistency standpoint, it depends what the group wants to go with, but previously they've been looked at differently, right, by the policy. So it's up to, I guess, this group if they want to recommend that travel lane is a travel lane or not. Right?
Yeah, I just wonder if they were considered different types of travel lanes, like high frequency or something like that.
I mean, I think we see that in the policy. The question is, what does the EDC want to recommend going forward?
and comment on the design comments from Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Tom's comment that I think you're talking about parklets, and this slide's talking about barriers, where we are saying maximum height 36 inches. That's it. But you can put a planter on top with greenery. And if we don't want to have greenery on top of them, I mean, that's where we're giving that. So you could have plants that actually grow to, 2 feet tall or something out of your planter box. But this isn't the parklet thing. The next slide is the parklets like the press room and the goat.
I think Tom's.
But I'm back to prior slide. There's nothing that has any limits on sidewalks themselves, on the height of barriers on the
sidewalks.
side.
And that we may want to put in and make it the same as this, make it 36.
That was my point. Yeah, I'm just saying.
But it's a different instance and a different discussion. If we go to the parklets, what do we allow there? And that's up for discussion.
Yeah, no, that was part of my point, was that if you're adjacent to traffic, then you may need a higher barrier. But I just think when you're on the sidewalk, particularly the traditional ones where you're set back against the building, I think having, separating units that.
And I haven't measured those, but I feel like 36 would certainly get them at the right place. Does anyone know how high those, like popovers or the district? I'd have to go measure to make sure 36 accommodates what is already there.
Yeah.
Because what's there looks perfectly nice.
Yeah, my only concern is we've got limits
Right, to
everywhere else,
put
but
it in
except
there.
sidewalks.
Yeah.
Someone could come in and put an 8-foot,
Good point.
Yeah.
wooden barrier there that would that almost turn it into a fenced-in yard.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Back on the sidewalk, should there be an expectation of the ability to continue to pass over a sidewalk if it's being used for outdoor dining?
Yes, I
That's in
believe
code.
that
Yes.
is already required in the
A
current.
minimum width, yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's part of the design, I believe, so that there's at least a minimum.
Right, it wouldn't be approved.
There are instances where that's not the case in town. That's why I was asking.
Okay.
Good point.
It reminds me that there are a few, they're limited, but a few instances where it's necessary to have Jersey barriers on a sidewalk because they're adjacent to parking. So, for instance, the Hammer has their outdoor space on that corner. If they didn't have a Jersey barrier, there'd be cars that would be pulling in right next to it. So there might need to be an adjustment on this, or on the sidewalk section that would say that, city-provided Jersey barriers will be used where the seating area is adjacent to either a travel lane or a parking space.
I think we get that on the fourth bullet.
But again, you're.
Can also be used on other edges for safety to be determined by city. Does that cover that?
It's what I have in mind, it's just that, again, because we've separated these into sidewalk barriers, parking space, travel lane barriers, and then platform and parklets, in construing this, if you look at this, you tend to think
Would
that these
add that
bullet points
language
only apply to this.
To the
not-
sidewalk page.
It's just a small point, but it,
Phil?
Yeah, I guess I wonder, it's kind of, isn't it a goal to try to get rid of the Jersey barriers?
Yes.
And I wonder if maybe there needs to be, rather than a policy of having a Jersey barrier on that situation, maybe having a setback, so less of the sidewalk is available.
yeah, the problem is that the devil's in the details. The 2012 ordinance is very detailed.
Yeah.
And there are things in it that are very substantive in their outcome, and one of which is that the restaurant use of the sidewalk has to be adjacent to its building, so you never run into this. But then you get to something like the Hammer, where the sidewalk, because you got that little bump out there, the sidewalk, if it wasn't for that bump out, you wouldn't be able to have dining there, because the sidewalk's not wide enough to accommodate the 5-foot width and have tables or chairs. It goes back to the earlier comments, which is a lot of this is going to have to be streetscape redesign at some point in the future. But we're still going to have this problem, because after you redo Market Square, somebody's going to want to do this down on Hanover Street or some other place, and it's never going to go away.
No.
At some point, you just have to say, you can't have it everywhere.
Right.
Some
I
people
guess that's
have
my point.
properties that accommodate it very well.
Right.
And others don't. I mean,
It's not fair everywhere. It's equitable.
It's not
not
fair.
fair.
I think that's what we're trying to at least accomplish, uniform standards and best practices, so that if it's outside of that, that it would not be an option.
Keep going. We're on the last slide.
Okay, so, John, do you want to run through these as city?
Yes, in terms of the changes, platforms are limited to a maximum width of the on-street parking space so as not to encroach upon any travel lanes. Very consistent with what staff is recommending, and replacing that 10-foot number from the curve that came out of the working group. And the last one is, there was a question about what is primarily transparent? What does that mean? So they asked to strike that as a thought, and it really needs to be see-through, transparent. And there was a question about where you're standing and looking, like if you're standing head-on to some of the things that are out there today, you can see through it. If you're on an angle, it looks solid.
Right.
So I think it's just a question of really trying to focus on pedestrian and vehicular trade safety. And then there was added this height maximum 72 inches that came out of this group as well. Just to make sure we're capping things off.
Can I speak to the third bullet real quick?
Yes.
It's fair to say that we have restaurants that are not fully abiding by how far they encroach, so this would honor that and
Right.
make
That
sure
was the
people
intent.
conform. Pardon?
That's the intent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And if I could, Phil, so when we struck the 10 feet, I don't know if what's here, what's being suggested solves our issue.
Well, this speaks to the inconsistency of the width of parking spaces
Right.
in a lot of cases. Some are 8, some are 9, some are...
But I think what we were specifically speaking to was the angled parking, which is, I think we decided is maybe 16 feet deep.
The angle at Thirsty
right.
News is
In front of
16.
is
But this
16.
was also about how wide could press room be, how wide could, and then when we started to measure, we realized
Right.
that parking spaces were all over the place on
Right.
width. So their language does help with the in the parking space
Does it?
parklet, but not it does not
Right.
address the
Because once you
the Thirsty
build out
News.
to a parking space, then you've got, in some cases, a Jersey barrier creeping into the street beyond that. This has to account for
But
any protection to keep you within that.
Everything has
Eric's
to be
right.
within the parking space.
We lost that intent to hold the angled parking to the width of a parallel parking
Correct.
space. So maybe just language just need to be put back in to address
Thank you.
that.
That's what I'm
Yes,
concerned
that's
about.
it,
because That's the
exactly.
choke
Yep.
point. You know,
So that any diagonal parking needs to have a separate bullet here.
Yep.
Right.
And then I'm not,
You
is
should
it
say
8
not
feet?
to
Is it-
exceed the width of
Yeah.
The
whatever.
average.
There is no,
parking space.
like, what is the width of a parking
Well,
space? Is it 8 or
maybe
9
it's
or
an
9 and a
average.
half?
You
But
you
if
pick the
can't exceed
maximum.
width, then you can't exceed the width, no matter what the measurement is.
But it can't be
Well, the
the
width
depth
at
of an
Thirsty-
angled parking space.
No.
That's what we're
Width at
getting to.
Thirsty
right.
is
That's
16.
right.
Right,
And we're not looking for that. We're looking for
8 to 10.
8, 9, 10. I'm not sure what the number is.
I do think we should try to be as consistent as possible, just to make it easier for the staff to be able to
Correct.
review, approve, govern.
Enforce.
Yeah, so where there's variability, I would recommend that either we as the EDC make sure that our recommendations are uniform as much as possible and allow others to inject changes there, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to enforce.
But I think an 8 or 9 foot or 10-foot variability on parallel spaces is different fundamentally than angled spaces. So I
Yes.
think if we call that out in the bullet, I think that covers it.
Yeah, I think angled needs its own bullet.
Yeah.
Yeah, angled needs its own bullet, because that, like I said, if you were, right now, there's 3 coffee shops within very close distance, and first thing in the morning, and that was what we were trying to solve for, was first thing in the morning, there are trucks loading and unloading on either side of the street, and there are dollies going back and forth, and people pulling in and out, getting coffee. That's a choke. It's a
Yeah.
really, it's a safety issue and a choke point, so we felt like
Is that Market Square? Like,
in Market
Yeah,
Square,
that's what-
right in front
we just gotta
of
get rid
Bagel
of that.
Works, and
Okay.
that has to be
Great.
half the width so that we can get, safety.
And that addresses the equity issue as well. A parking space is not a parking space, is not a parking space if you want to make it fairer.
Right.
Tom?
Somebody made a comment that reminded me that right now this advocates or states that parking is limited to essentially the width of the parking space. But you still have the width of the barrier for those parking spaces. So I think the limitation should be the inclusive of any barriers as well. So,
Yeah,
so
that's how it's been.
it's
We
but
should
this doesn't
spell
say
that
that.
out.
That's the problem. So.
Yep, agreed.
It is always a surprise to the restaurants when they realize the barrier takes up 2 feet.
Right.
And their 8 feet wide space is actually only 6 feet of
Right.
usable space.
Okay.
That's it.
Any further
Slides.
comment from EDC? I think at this point, we should invite those who've come to speak to come share their thoughts and feedback on what was circulated. So
Mr.
anyone-
Chair, would you like me to remove the slides? Or no? Okay.
So would anybody like to provide comment?
Question first.
Sure.
So these recommendations, are we voting on these
No.
or
No.
not?
Nope.
Okay.
No.
My intent would be to hear from anyone who's come to speak, and
And
I don't
then-
think we've closed
so
the
what-
loop.
what's the timing of this?
I think if anything, we would come back as a full commission at our next meeting to,
Because there's no rush, right? Because this would be for next year.
Well,
I think there,
There's
is.
a timeline, but not a rush.
yeah,
Right.
there's a timeline.
Okay.
Not a rush.
What is it?
The goal is to get these in place before next year's public dining session so that.
Before this year's dining ends.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
The goal is to let businesses know 3, 4, 5, 6 months ahead of time
Right,
what to
okay.
expect.
Yeah,
Here's
right.
here's an ordinance.
It's
Yeah.
not like next month.
That's what city council asked for.
Okay.
come on,
My name is Christine Lathan.
you want to come speak so you have a microphone? Yeah.
I'm Christine Lathan. I'm a resident of Portsmouth for about 30 years. I live at 29 Orchard Court. I travel the roads of Portsmouth every day, multiple times, and primarily that intersection at Congress Street and Jumpin' Jays is of concern of mine. I've been there many busy times of the day, 5 o'clock, 5 or after. I've been there where the emergency crews were trying to get through one time, and people are just scrambling to get out of the way. There's not a lot of room there to get out of the way, and then to have outdoor dining taking up the whole left-hand lane adds to that. My concern is for citizens as well as tourists. It's not if, but when someone gets hurt. The visibility there, turning left, is almost nil. I was in a Suburban this morning, I purposely went down that road and made that left-hand turn. And even in a Suburban, it's hard to see over those barriers, and because it's right to the corner. So, and you know how people are. They walk right out, even when there's visibility, and you as a pedestrian or a vehicle have to be aware because there's a lot of tourists around. People don't know where to go. And it's just the aggressiveness of things. People want to get to where they're going, and as well as the construction that is going on in the city, I think creates traffic flow patterns are different, as well as the influx of everyone in the city too. I think it's a very dangerous spot. I'm opposed to any travel lanes being used for outdoor dining. As far as parking spaces, that's fine as long as it's not on a corner, not taking up something that's going to be a hindrance to visibility within the city. But I've had many comments on Facebook through the Portsmouth sites raising concern about this because I don't see it ending well if that remains.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Come on up.
Hi.
Good morning.
I kind of came in a little late. My name is Stephanie Crawford, and I'm the manager of Clay's Retail. And there's a couple of points I wanted to make. It seems like it's a foregone conclusion that the restaurants in the streets are here to stay. Just things need to be worked out. I would say that as far as retailers and other non-restaurant people, every single penny that is associated with those spots should be paid by the restaurants. Not that the city subsidizes it and therefore our taxes go up, because we do pay part of the taxes as part of our rent. Because if a restaurant feels that it's in their interest to do it and they're going to make money, then they will definitely pay that fee. That's a business decision. if it's not commensurate with what it's going to take away from the city, there's no reason why every business can't say, let's fly it up the flag and see if it flies, based on, and having everything revolve around that. So yes, it does attract people, but having inconvenient spots with empty tables also does not really look good either. And it's the same thing as when you raise parking tickets. You know that if you get a parking ticket for $5, people will blow it off. What's $5? They'll just do it. So you have to raise them so that they take it seriously. So this is the same thing. We do not want to subsidize the restaurants. We help them, we back them up, we want to support them. Certainly, we back them up, and we do support them. We recommend places. We're always recommending restaurants. But we do not want to pay or subsidize another industry. We can't afford it, and that changes our price structure. So that's one thing. The other thing is, since it is a foregone conclusion, and when you talk about design, excuse me, there's engineering design for safety, and that's been discussed. And I understand, you know, all experts like that, but there's also a visual design that has to be considered. Portsmouth has to decide if it wants to go in the direction of looking like a Newport or Newburyport, or if it wants to start looking like Hampton Beach. And I can tell you, from a situation of, I have friends who will, you know, they're retiring or whatever, and they'll want to move to a condo, but they'll say, I'm not moving to a condo, they have too many rules. The reason they have those rules is because you don't want to pay X amount of dollars for your condo, and then some guy decides he's going to fix all his automobiles and drop oil and everything next door because there are no rules. Or somebody else parks an RV in the driveway. The place starts lowering in its value. And I know that the street parking definitely would bring more people, but if it's not done, and that we would all benefit from that, if it's not done correctly, we will all be hurt by it for the same reason. So it's extremely important that it's approached, and the visual thing, I can tell you, Newburyport does it well. Newburyport has, it's narrow, they're all on wooden, I forget what they call them, but they're like wooden platforms. Because also, if you're eating on the street, you're going to see cigarette butts all over the place. People aren't going to do that if there's a little platform. Newburyport, everybody has to have white chairs. They have to have red umbrellas, no logos, which I see you have. But these are all things that we really have to take into consideration to make it really a nice thing. Otherwise, because what's acceptable aesthetically to me may not be to the next person. Everyone has their own interpretation. And boy, it can be varied. So, and also, is someone going to be in charge of kind of policing that? And I don't mean to say policing, but just someone that, sort of like, the same thing with the traffic people. They go around and make sure everything, what are you doing here? What are you doing there? So that all of a sudden it's not a free-for-all. I think it's very important that that aspect is considered. But the money part, absolutely, it should not fall on the shoulders of other industries in Portsmouth. Because if someone doesn't think that they can, I'm sorry to use this example, but what is it? Not bull moose, moose with the thirsty moose with the two layers of all those picnic tables. They're always empty. Now you go down to the goat, and there's a line around the block even with eating outside. So why should that take two widths? And it just doesn't make sense. But again, it's probably reasonable enough that why not try it? Because maybe people will come. So that's a business decision. If they are held to pay for what they use, directly related to what they're taking away from the city in parking fees for that time period, that can be figured out, that can't be a hard thing to figure out, then they will make a critical decision whether it's worth it for them or not. And they will also take more care following the rules. So that's it. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, as we transition, I just want to make a point to Stephanie's
Yes.
comment that, and I appreciate all your comments, I think they're great. When there is a reduction in parking to be paid, it has no bearing on the taxpayers. Our parking fund is separate from the general fund, so I think you have a good point about subsidizing the or what the businesses are doing, but if there's ever a reduction in parking, it has no bearing on the taxpayers having to make up the difference. Our parking fund is separate and apart from
But who makes up the difference?
our general fund. It's just a reduction in the parking fund.
But somebody's got to.
Right, but I just want to make sure people know it doesn't impact the taxpayers. The taxpayers are not bearing the burden. It purely means a reduction in what comes into our parking revenue bucket, so to speak.
Okay. There's always, if there's a shortfall, there's a way you have to make it up. That's just, may not fall on us, maybe. But, at the end of the day, the restaurants for pay, if they built
Agreed.
an addition, they'd have to pay for that. So, anyway, thank you. Thank you.
Morning.
Morning, Peter.
Can I hand out prints from last night's Post?
Peter, just state your
Peter
name.
Harris, 249 Islington Street, resident of 32 years in Portsmouth. I want to appreciate the last two speakers and Christine's post last night. I think gathered a lot of new data and responses to the other two that I had sent to you last night on email. There is a obvious safety issue, which I think you're addressing, and I applaud and empathize with all that you're going through to kind of work through this. There's been a lot of good points. I can tell you're listening, although I do have to say street travel, the restaurants and street travel outside, this should not exist, especially in the busiest travel street outside of the downtown area where Goat and Jumping Jays are, right up to the crosswalk. 30 feet back is an attempt, but still, there's another issue, the traffic flow. And it's not all the time, but there's a lot of traffic flow where it's backed up to Chapel Street, which is down by the bridge almost, and it's bumper to bumper all the way through. When that bridge comes down from after changing, a lot of cars could be backed up there, and that again, it's crazy. And I travel through there a lot, and I know a lot of people from out of town don't know better, and they're just going to wait in that line because they know it's there. Well, there are outlets, but and as a resident, I'll take them. But people get frustrated, and you come up to that intersection, now you have no visibility, you're frustrated. That's a dangerous situation. Dwyer's was mentioned as another one-way travel lane, and there was a discussion about being 1,000 cars per day or less. That's today what it's like on that road. That's going to change. There's a new hotel going in right by the garage there, and apartments, I believe, and that's going to change the traffic flow there. So it doesn't make sense to me either. Plus, it is an outlet to the neighborhood where I come in and out of, and like on the day of the parade, I couldn't get into my neighborhood. That's a one-day thing, but that lane would have been great to have available to me. So safety concerns for pedestrians, driver visibility, exhaust concerns while eating. It's just, I hope you guys can get something done, and I hope it can be something that council can't ignore, because this year's policy was ignored by council to what was recommended. It doesn't make any sense to me. They're going to do what they want. That shouldn't be allowed to happen. Maybe there should be some type of parking incentive for merchants to provide to their shoppers to help that could help merchants out. And I think you should expand the abutter approval. Just the first floor tenant isn't good enough. I mean, it impacts on a resident abutter notice when somebody's building. It's, I think, a circle of. I'm not sure how big the circle is, but it's a pretty significant circle. I'm not saying it needs to be something like that, but at least all the abutters that are right there that have some impact, owners as well as tenants. And yeah, losing the left lane is just, it's, I think, a problem. I have nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Appreciate it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Liza Hewitt, and I live at 726 Middle Road. A couple of things that were discussed here on your slides. I have some concern about whether or not you can limit the size of some of these outdoor dining areas. You know, there are some restaurants that have literally one parking spot. They probably fit one table, maybe two. I look at something like the Thirsty Moose downtown that looks like it has an entire city block. And so the look of it doesn't really, I mean, it's huge. And I guess I don't understand. I guess you could say, well, if they want to pay for it, they can have it. But I just wonder if you shouldn't consider that. What Mr. Harris said about the Dwyers and the under 1,000 cars, I can understand that in theory, but I do think you need to consider what is going in right behind Dwyers. And I will agree. I got a call from my son during that parade saying, how am I going to get to my apartment? He lives on McDonough Street. And I said, I don't know. I guess if you really need to, you'll have to go up Hanover Street the wrong way. I mean, I didn't know what to tell him. And so I think what would have happened if there was an emergency at his neighbor's house and they had needed to get there quickly and there was no way to get into that neighborhood. Granted, it was one day, but one day could make all the difference for somebody in an emergency situation. And that hotel has potential for being a real problem. The abutter approval. I remember... it was probably back in the fall, and there was a discussion from some city councilors that were meeting with the director of planning at the time. And I remember sitting in a meeting, hearing that discussion, and that planning director was concerned about abutter notices for people living in condos abutting those areas. And I believe that was taken off the table by members of the city council because they felt that if people living in those condos complained about the outdoor dining would be taken away. So it was more a concern to keep the outdoor dining versus the abutters' concern. So that was discussed. It was brought up, and I think it was back in the fall in one of those initial plans that was considered. Jumpin' Jays, I spoke about this the last time I was here. I spoke about this at 2 PTS meetings. I spoke about this in front of the city council. I don't want somebody killed there, and it's a concern. And I guess, what I'm hearing is that, yes, we are talking about the plan going forth for next year, but what about right now? We've got 3 months left. We have 3 months worth of lives left that are crossing those streets, that are driving through that intersection. So I would like to know, and I don't know whether you can do, but somebody's got to do something. This is fine going forth, but what about right now in a situation in which I have yet to hear anybody, and I have asked, will somebody please tell me this is safe? If you can tell me this is safe, then I can say, okay, you've looked at it, it's safe. I cannot get anybody from the city to tell me it's safe. I can't get anybody from any of the committees I've spoken in front of to tell me it's safe. And that says to me it's not safe. So I want to know what we're going to do right now. And if that's cutting down the bushes at Jumpin' Jays, at least I can see people crossing the street. Somebody's got to do something, and they've got to do it yesterday or at least by tomorrow morning. I want to be careful about Portsmouth. And, I agree with the woman that sat over here. You know, every year my husband buys me a little calendar from downtown, and it's got, you know, the month, and it's got a picture of Portsmouth that's been painted. And as I look out down Congress Street today, at this moment, I wonder whether I'm going to want that calendar if the painting is what I see going on down there. You know, you've got hundreds of people moving here. They've read about it online, and they've read about it in magazines, and this is the very best place to live. It's why I live here. But I am concerned that the very things that people are moving here for, that tourists are coming here for, we're losing. And I want to make sure that that doesn't happen. Because once it goes, you're not going to get it back. Once those people decide that it's not a place they want to come visit because they used to come for the history and it's no longer here, you're not going to get it back. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to everybody sitting at this table, because I can tell from the discussion today that you've put a lot of thought into this. And as I said, I've sat through more than a few meetings at other committees and have felt totally unheard. And I feel like you guys have listened, and I want to thank you for that. I can hear it coming through in your discussion. I can hear the fact that you listened to the concerns of citizens that have come to speak. We don't do this because we've got nothing else going on in our lives. I've got plenty of things going on. But, you know, I worry about my neighbors. I worry about the other residents. I worry about the character of Portsmouth. I worry about our safety. And that's why I come and speak, because I feel like I can. I don't do social media, although I'm very much, you know, in awe of people that can put that stuff out in social media. So I come to these meetings and speak. It's very hard when you feel like nobody's listening, and I feel like you really have listened. I would like to recommend that instead of working in silos, I hear, you know, Mr. Cohen saying, you know, well, this is a safety issue, that's not really our purview. And this is what I'm hearing as I listen in meetings. Something is not everybody's purview. I would encourage you mentioned HDC today. That's wonderful. Let's get something together where members of this committee that have worked in a subgroup to come up with some of these, which are great, some of the recommendations you've made, and some members of the HDC, and maybe a member of the planning board who deals with downtown and development, and a city councilor, and a member of traffic and safety, and someone from Karen's staff. Get them together in a room and have them talk, not in silos of what we can't do, each committee, because you never get a whole picture that way. You just get pieces. And then invite the citizens, because we live here and we do pay taxes. And I can understand Karen's point, but if that money is not being put into the parking fund, that money is being drawn out for things that are being used in the city. So if we can't draw that money out of the parking fund, then we are going to raise our taxes to be able to afford what we used to draw out of the parking fund. So it is impacting us. Let us speak. We live here. We should have the ability, and some of us have some views that might be worthwhile to you, and I think that's true because I heard you talking about them today. So thank you very much. I appreciate all your time and effort on this.
Thank you.
Morning, Petra Huda, 280 South Street. I think you've had some great revisions from the last time we were here. I wrote some notes down, and I'd like to go over them with you. The one thing on the abutter notices is the first thing. I think you need to look at not just the ground floor abutters here. Maybe the perspective should be on who is affected by this, because you do have professional services that are being affected above the restaurants, above the retailers, that need the parking spaces. So maybe a different look at this would be who is being affected by what the ground floor is going to do as an abutter, and actually put that into your rules here. Next, the stuff that you were going to recommend to the fee committee. I think that Tom had a bunch of great ideas. I also was excited to hear the words fully burdened, because that's what we're missing right now. Yes, you're looking at the cost of lost revenue, you're looking at the cost of to put all of this in, but there are a lot of staff costs, and those were not included previously. And if you're going to look going forward for a realistic view to the city, that needs to be in there. I also thought it was a good suggestion about revenue being generated. If you're looking at, you can't ask people to tell you what kind of profit they're making here. If they give that information out, great. We've had quite a few vendors actually say, I've made this much on this, this is what this means to me. But the other thing is you're going to have to rely on estimates on that, I think. And to look at the increase for one, I'll just say for the restaurants versus the decrease for other business, other professional services, anybody else downtown that is not a restaurant, that you're actually taking their parking spot, or you're taking their space, or you're taking their ownership there, that there is a cost there. There's a, like was said, there's a lost opportunity cost there. So that was another thing. I thought the discussion was great about the base fee, and I don't know if you want to call it a location fee, whatever you want to call it there. I think you're going in the right direction there, especially for that. Next, on the design standards, I urge you to look at not only what staff has to say, but also your land use boards. HDC is a big one because that is totally included in the historic district, and the policies, not just of what the staff has, but basically what your parking laws actually say. I agree totally with the no travel lanes. It was brought up this year, and as I recall, it was overridden. The next thing is also there's also a concern about safety is enforcement. We do have non-compliant barriers downtown that are affecting safety, as you've heard, and I think that's up to the city staff to look at that and make recommendations and actually enforce it. I was glad that Sarah brought up the minimum walking space. That would be nice if that was enforced, as all of the citizens are entitled to use the public space. The other thing that was interesting that Tom definitely brought up was to include the width of any barriers, that they don't exceed that. That's another enforcement issue. The discussion about how ugly the barriers are and what to do with them and what to change them and make them better is kind of, from my perspective, is kind of it's a safety issue. The reason we're putting barriers is to protect people from somebody coming around a corner, being on their phone. The other thing is, are we exposing the people who don't have this big protection of a cement block there to a safety issue? Just something to consider. That was also discussed on what to do on the sidewalks. The last thing, I would beg to differ with the city manager that parking revenue does not affect the taxpayers. The taxpayers fund the operations of the parking department. That comes out of our property taxes. Yes, the parking revenue helps, but all the expenses and everything that goes to the city comes out of the taxpayer dollar, and parking revenue is part of that. Thank you for all the work you've done. I think the committees have done a great job, and glad to see you back. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Anybody else? Further public comment? Thank you, everyone. David? No?
No, I've actually got another meeting here at 9, so we'll get you guys out of here.
Great.
All right, let's go.
So with that, let's just bring the public comment portion to a close. we're tight on time, so I apologize to Vince for the council update.
That's all right. Very little, if you want to just, I can just bring up a couple interesting things. Flash vote, we had our first flash vote experiment, and that came out, that's very interesting, and had some results from that. I can't, off the top of my head, describe what that was, but we're looking to do that more. We reached an agreement with Newcastle for our sewer, for their sewer, so that's going ahead. Bellamy Reservoir, we've received a number of grants, about $1.4 million to increase our watershed protection, so that's great. We did the bonding for the CIP. There's other things, but, that's kind of the highlight. I don't want to take up more time.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm not aware of any other business, but if anyone else has some.
I think the only thing that would be good for the public that arrived to just share what the next steps are as far as the feedback and the recommendations and any rough timeline. I'm assuming we'll continue this discussion at our next EDC meeting.
Yes, absolutely. So that was my next on our list. We've got August 4th or September 8th. Feels like we've got enough feedback and commentary here, and to try to keep some forward progress, I would suggest we keep the August 4th date, even though it's 2 weeks from today. But I feel like there was a lot brought up that we can continue and try to bring refinements to what was presented today based on the commission's comments. I think we need to try to engage some other stakeholders from some of the key boards that we heard about today and potentially try to incorporate them into that next meeting. So I would say next steps for all of us would be to keep that date for August 4th, see if we can get some other speakers that are critical in ongoing enforcement or in future enforcement for what we've envisioned, and continue the dialogue and make some final decisions. I think there's some open items that were brought up today that need some more time to talk through and work through. And the other thing that I mentioned in our last meeting that I would bring to the group today would be dates through the rest of the year so that everyone can try to get our calendars lined up. I don't know what paper I've got that on, but I think the working dates through the rest of the calendar year would be the August 4th meeting we just discussed, September 8th, October 6th, November 3rd, and December 1st. So getting back to the first Friday of every month. So this will be the last kind of 2-week interval we have. But just so that everyone can firm up their planning. So appreciate everyone's time and input and feedback and energy. Nothing further.
So will is it a working group that is working on the outdoor dining? Will they have revisions again for us next meeting?
Yeah, I think
So we're still going through that.
I think that's the primary purpose for the August 4th, is to continue the forward progress on this. So I would expect we'd have updates.
And when
based
is
on
the date when that's supposed to be done?
When do we refer back to council? Is that the question?
Yeah.
So there is no date certain.
No,
It's to be
okay.
timely with letting outdoor dining folks understand what the rules of the road will be.
Right. I didn't know if we had a date certain for that.
I think there would have been maybe a target of August, but I think there's a lot still open that we kind of got to get through what we're working through before we hit that point. All right. Entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thanks, everybody.